Hello, guys, and welcome to Fight Focus. Hopefully, this will be the first of maybe a wee series, depending on how this one goes. Idea of it is I'm going to take a fight that's coming up that I find interesting, and we'll talk about it. So let me know what you think of it, and let me know if you think the things that I talk about are absolute garbage. It's always good to learn from other people. So today we're going to talk about the rematch between Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington. If you haven't seen the first fight, would definitely recommend checking it out. Maybe have a look at it after I've talked about a few things in here to see if you can spot them for yourself. Now, this is a rematch from their first fight, which happened at the end of 2019. And since then, Usman's gone on to fight three times, Masvidal twice and Burns once, and Covington has only fought once against Tyron Woodley. And we've seen what's happened to Tyron Woodley there, so you can't really take much from a win like that. Now, if we have a look at kind of the stats of these two guys, Usman stands 6 feet tall, Covington 5'11", so not really much going on there. But a big difference is made up in the reach. So Usman's got a huge reach for his size. He's got a 76-inch reach compared to Covington's 72-inch reach. Now, this is interesting as well because normally when you have guys with a longer reach, they tend to be on the skinnier side. But if you've seen Usman, he is fucking huge for a welterweight. We'll talk about the reach a bit further as well later on. So in terms of the records, very similar. Usman's got the 19 wins with the one loss that he sustained quite early on in his career, whereas Covington's got a 16-2 record with his only losses coming to Alves earlier in his UFC career and Usman. Now, in terms of their fighting styles, they both come from a wrestling background, and they're both pretty classical wrestler boxers, but they're slightly different in their approach to doing that. You can use some of the stats that you find on the UFC's website to kind of break that down a little bit further. So if we look at their striking accuracy, so that's the number of strikes they throw and the proportion of which they land. Usman has a striking accuracy of 54%, and this is in comparison to Covington, who has an accuracy of 38%. Now, in that, it looks like Covington's the worst striker, but you have to think of why is Covington throwing strikes versus why is Usman throwing strikes. Like I said earlier, Usman's a larger guy, so he's a bit more powerful. So when he throws the strikes, it tends to be single shots. It's like one or two punches at a time. He doesn't really throw extended combinations. If you have a fighter like that, whenever they tend to throw, it means they're throwing because they know they're going to land. So their striking accuracy tends to be a wee bit higher. Whereas Covington is very much a volume fighter. In a lot of his fights, apart from the one against Usman, which was a bit different, he tends to throw his strikes to set up his takedowns. So even though it's 38%, you have to think of why is he throwing each of these strikes. He's throwing them so you cover up and the takedown's available, so he's not bothered about landing every single one that he throws. In terms of their grappling accuracy, it's pretty similar at 47% for Usman and 52% for Covington. It's the takedown average per 15 minutes is what they do, so per fight on the UFC website. And this is where it gets a bit different in the wrestling between the two of them. So Usman's takedown average is 3.22 and Covington's is 5.69, which is a quite substantial bit more than Usman's. It's the kind of difference in grappling styles. So Usman, when he takes guys down, he quite likes to hold position. It's the same as if he's pinning someone against the fence. He likes to hold them there for extended periods of time where he can slowly chip away at them. Covington, on the other hand, likes to use the takedowns as a way of tiring guys out, not by keeping them on the ground, but by letting them work back to their feet and then taking them down again. A prime example was the fight against Rafael dos Anjos. Took dos Anjos down, dos Anjos would get his back to the fence, wall walk, get himself back to his feet, and then Covington would take him down later on. So it's strikes, takedown, strikes, takedown. I suppose that's the chaos is where his nickname comes from. And a big problem for Covington in the fight against Usman is he wasn't able to employ that strategy of taking Usman down and getting a break from the striking almost, which is how he tires most of his previous opponents out. So he didn't. It could be the reason why he got tired in that fight as well. In terms of the strikes by target, so where does each guy throw their strikes to, both of them are pretty similar in terms of their head strikes. So 61% of the strikes for Usman go to the head and 68% for Covington. But it's to the body and the legs is where there's a bit more of a difference. So for Usman, 30% of his strikes go to the body. And he's one of the few guys at the highest level that really attacks the body quite well. He doesn't attack the legs very often, which is due to him not having much of a kicking game. It just doesn't really matter for Usman. He has everything he needs. He's got the phenomenal wrestling background and he's a great puncher, so he doesn't actually have to build a kicking game in order to be successful. Covington, on the other hand, does have a relatively decent kicking game. He just doesn't use it very often. It's also included in his hazing, or where he'll throw punches, kicks, get the guys distracted to get into the takedown. He's not so much got a kicking game built around causing damage. Both of these guys have had fights since the first one, but I'm largely going to talk about the first fight here. So what can we really take away from the first fight between these two guys? So if you've seen the first fight, you know that it was largely just a boxing match inside an MMA cage with MMA gloves. That's pretty much what was going on. It would be interesting to see if either guy saw something in the first fight that would make them more prone to engaging in the wrestling, which would be great to see since they're both phenomenal grapplers. I would love to see them grapple. But because both guys had success in the striking in the first fight, I wouldn't be surprised if it was a very similar style of fight in the rematch. Now, one thing that I think was huge in the first fight that I think will probably carry over into the second fight was the stances of both guys. Now, if you're relatively new to striking, I'm going to have to first explain the concept of open stance and closed stance. So if you are in an open stance, it means you and your opponent are in opposite stances. So you're in orthodox, they're in southpaw. If you're in a closed stance, it means that you're both in the same stance, so both southpaw or both orthodox. Now, Covington is a strict southpaw when he fights, whereas Usman, more recently, has been showing that he can fight from both stances. Of course, the advantage of being able to fight from both stances is that you have more attacks available than your opponent. But it doesn't mean that fighting out of both stances doesn't have some drawbacks. It's very hard to be perfect in both stances. People will normally tend to lean towards one or the other. It's just naturally what's going to happen. So Usman was an orthodox fighter, and he's starting to use southpaw more. So if you're an orthodox fighter and you wanted to learn how to do some fighting out of southpaw, you'd probably start maybe shadow boxing in southpaw, hitting the bag, hitting pads. It'd be a while before you started really introducing it in sparring. And one of the great things is, like I said, you have more attacks. But one of the downsides is you're not as good defensively in your other stance. And that's something that was quite apparent with Usman early on in this fight. So in the first 2 rounds, he fought both southpaw and orthodox. But whenever he was in southpaw, which is the closed stance that we talked about before, he was having a bit more trouble dealing with Covington. And it was actually where he'd taken most of the damage in those early rounds. He was doing well, but he was giving Covington more of a chance to get into the fight when they were both in the same stance. As soon as he switched to open stance, so he was in orthodox, the rest of the fight started changing, and he actually did the final 3 rounds in orthodox, which is something to look out for if you manage to watch the fight. The reason open stance was more beneficial for Usman was because when you're in an open stance matchup, the fight happens at a longer distance. The reason for this is because your lead leg and your opponent's lead leg get in the way of each other. If you've watched a lot of striking or MMA before, you'll hear commentators talking about foot position in a southpaw versus orthodox matchup. So that's getting the outside foot position is something that's talked about commonly, but you can also get the inside foot position. Now, the reason they talk about this is because getting to these positions isn't all that easy, because you have to get outside or inside of your opponent's lead leg in order to be able to throw whatever strike you want to throw. Now, this isn't a problem, or isn't as much of a problem when you're in a closed stance matchup, because your lead legs aren't lined up directly, so it's quite easy to go across one another. So now going back to why the open stance was better for Usman. So remember I mentioned that Usman has this massive long reach. He's got this 76-inch reach. If you fight in an open stance, the fight happens at a longer range, and if you've got a longer reach, that's going to be more beneficial to you, especially when it's a boxing matchup where kicks aren't really as involved. And the open stance was made even better by Usman by the fact that when Covington throws his strikes, especially his left hand, if you watch him fight, you'll notice he throws a lot of looping shots. Whenever he's throwing his left cross, it's very rare that he throws it with full extension. He's normally throwing it with a bent arm as he goes in. And of course, if you're throwing a strike with a bent arm, you're not utilising your full reach compared to someone who's going to throw with a completely straight arm. So in this longer open stance matchup, Covington's throwing strikes, he's almost making his reach shorter, and then Usman's coming back with these perfectly straight strikes, so Covington's really struggling to close the distance on him. So when Usman was in southpaw, when they were in the close stance matchup, Covington could find it a lot easier to get closer, and because Covington's more of a combination striker, he found it easy to get in to range, land some of his strikes, and cause Usman problems. And you saw it, I'll add the clip in, there was one moment in the fight where they were both in a close stance, both in southpaw. Covington went in, landed some good shots, and immediately, as soon as Usman was panicking, he switched back into his orthodox stance. And that's clearly because if you're under fire and you're in the wrong stance, you're not as defensively responsible, so you're going to switch back into the stance where you're used to defending the strikes from. So that kind of leads on to the ranges that both guys like fighting at. So for Usman likes fighting at a long range where he can keep guys on the end of his long straight punches. Covington likes fighting at a slightly closer range where he can land his hooks. Because his hooks have shorter reach, it means he has to get a little bit closer, but when he's in his range to land them, they can be quite damaging. So for Usman, the way of dealing with this is thinking of being either all the way in or all the way out. If you're all the way out, you've got Covington on the end of your strikes. If you're all the way in, you're in a clinch position with Covington, which he showed in the first fight. He's stronger than Covington in the clinch. He lands some good knees from this position. So Usman is all the way in or all the way out, and Covington is the space in between, which is where he tends to do a lot of his damage. So if you're Covington, get in, land your strikes, and get out clean. That's how you deal with it. Usman, on the other hand, it's if Covington moves inside of your reach, tie him up as quickly as possible, land some clinch strikes, and then break back out the distance. Now, I mentioned before that it was largely a boxing match in the first fight, which was surprising because Covington's shown that he can kick. Like, he's got relatively decent kicking technique, even though he doesn't necessarily hurt people with his kicks. Well, he doesn't necessarily hurt people with his strikes. He's got very few finishes on his record. But one thing that Covington could use in the rematch is using his kicks if it is a long range fight. I'd be very interested to see if Usman decides to go southpaw in this fight, or if he strictly fights orthodox for the majority of it, which I think he might do. But if he does go southpaw, he's got techniques from there, but it just gives Covington more of a chance. So if it is this long range fight, use your long range weapons, use your kicks. If you're not going to throw the straight punches, then use long kicks. That's another weapon. He did a good job of landing the head kick on Usman. Usman's not really one to, or he didn't show in that fight, to move back out the way of the strike. So if you can just constantly land a kick onto Usman's arm, at the very least you're preventing him from throwing the right hand or worrying about throwing strikes to the body. If someone's going to throw a right hand to the body, they're leaving their face exposed. So if you're constantly making someone worry about that head kick, then it keeps their right hand at home to block. One thing I was thinking about that Covington could try and use was the low kicks, which is something that Usman hasn't really had much trouble dealing with. I made a video before about leg kick counter for boxers and actually used Usman as an example, and I'll do a wee link up to it there if you want to have a look on how it works. But the problem for Covington is he tried using the low kicks early in the fight, And every time he would go for, this was in an open stance matchup, he didn't throw it from a closed stance, which he should. I'll explain why after. But when he was trying it from an open stance, so that's when we're in opposite stances, every time he would throw it, he was getting countered by the jab of Usman. It happened once. He did it the first time, he got countered. He did it the second time, he got countered. The third time, he should have thrown it, and instead of just keeping his head in the centre when he threw the kick, just move your head off to the side, and then the jab would have slipped past him. So that's something he could try and implement in the next fight. But it is also difficult to land the rear leg low kick in an open stance matchup. Now, it's for that reason that Conor McGregor actually managed to go so far in his career without having really any issues with the low kick. If you're in an open stance matchup, so if you imagine it for yourself, you're standing in orthodox and your opponent's standing in southpaw. If you go to throw your rear leg low kick to the inside and think you're not in like a Thai stance, you're in more of like an MMA bladed boxing style stance, all the person that you're attacking has to do is lift up their leg or turn their knee even further in the direction it's already facing, and you're just going to kick straight into their knee and straight into their shin. So it's not easy to land the inside low kick because the check is just so easily available. So that was the problem for Covington in this fight, is you couldn't really commit to throwing a low kick with power because the chance of it getting checked was just too high. Weirdly enough, in the very end of the fight, like I think it was the fifth or fourth round, he did actually start landing a lot of good inside low kicks, but it's a shame that he waited until that late in the fight before doing it. But if the inside low kick isn't available, then outside low kick. Alexander Volkanovski's been using it to great effect. It might not be the most damaging technique in the world, but it can add up and it looks good for the judges. I mean, that's largely the reason that Volkanovski won the fights against Holloway, is just he landed more shots and a lot of them were this outside low kick. So yeah, the kicking was good. He should be attacking the body with his kicks as well. But the only problem you have to worry about with attacking the body is the kick catch is a lot more readily available. I don't think either guy wants to get taken down, and getting a kick caught is an easy way for that to happen. So for Covington, I would say either front kick to the body because they're harder to catch, or a round kick to the legs or the head. Usman actually used the front kick to the body of Covington really well throughout the fight, which is, if you've ever felt one of them before, it's a very winding technique and it stops you wanting to come in, because if you run in, it's like running into the point of a spear and it just takes the wind out of you. You don't want to advance any further forward. Yeah, so during the first fight, Usman just attacked. He just mixed it up better. He attacked the body, he attacked the head, whereas Covington seemed to be a lot more head hunting during it. He wasn't really working the body of Usman. In a 5-round fight at the pace that these guys fight at, you've got to attack the body in order to wear the other guy out. So in terms of kind of like an overall idea for what both guys have to do, for Usman, I wouldn't change all that much. I would come out in this open stance matchup, keep it as a long range fight, use your long range weapons. If Covington starts pressuring you inside, clinch, land your knee strikes in close. He also did good work to the body when Covington was coming in. Use your kicks to the body as well, but I wouldn't really see much changing for Covington. Throw a straight punch. Like, don't throw this looping strike if you're trying to get close. He did do a good job, to be fair, of throwing his left hand in order to get close enough to land his right hand, either with a hook or an up jab. But if you want to just kind of fight this long range fight with Usman, you've got to throw with a straight arm. In fact, the one or two times he actually did it in the fight, he managed to catch Usman clean. So there's like a perfect reason for doing it. Attack the body of Usman, attack the legs of Usman. Yeah, that's pretty much it. To be honest, in terms of a prediction for this fight, I can't really see anyone beating Usman for the foreseeable future, especially the confidence he's gained in himself with the wins over Burns and the knockout of Masvidal. Like, I guess dangerous if he's got confidence in his hands as well. And because he's quite a large welterweight, and Covington's he is a good sized welterweight, but he's also one of those guys that would fit into that 165-pound division if it were to be created. I'm not sure if he'll actually have the power to be able to cause Usman a whole lot of problems. So yeah, I think we'll call it there for today for the first fight focus. Let me know what you thought about it. I hope it wasn't too all over the place. I've just been trying to go from some prompts on the notes. But let me know what you think, and if you'd like to see any more of these in the future, and if you would like to see any more, let me know what fights you'd like me to break down. Thanks for watching. I'll see you for the next one.